Washington Journal continues.
We're back with Matt Welch, who is the editor at large at Reason Magazine, and we're here this morning with us to talk about the impact of Democratic pandemic policies. Matt, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, first of all, tell us, for our viewers who might not be reading, which they all should be, tell us what Reason Magazine is and what Reason focuses on.
Reason Magazine was founded in 1968 by a 20-year-old college student named Lanny Friedlander from Boston University. It's a magazine for free minds and free markets. It has a libertarian orientation, small l, not affiliated with the Libertarian Party at all, and it's an attempt to discuss elements in culture and politics from a point of view stressing individuality, individualism, free markets, and just freedom overall. We're findable at reason.com. We do a lot of audiovisual stuff, Reason TV videos and podcasts as well.
So your recent article is called The Equity Mess. So first of all, tell us why you decided to write this article.
You know, it was actually not supposed to be about equity at all. I was tasked by my editor to look at pandemic policies, particularly policies that might impact people in the economy and elsewhere going in the future. Like what have we done? How is it going to affect us? And a thing that I discovered along the way, which is just alarming, startling, anomalous, was looking at the disparate economic impacts by the state. Just sort states out by looking from, and this was the band that was available at the time that I was putting the story together, between February 2020, basically the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, to the end of December of 2020, and looked at, all right, which states lost the highest percentage of jobs, which states lost the lowest percentage of jobs, and in fact, in a couple of cases, gained jobs. The 18 states that lost the most jobs all voted for Joe Biden. That's a weird kind of coincidence, and not one that I went looking for at all, as someone who's not a Democrat and not Republican and don't have a natural rooting interest in either party. The 18 states that lost the fewest jobs, all 18 were run by Republicans, governors and legislature, unified government. 16 of the 18 voted for Donald Trump. That's weird, to say the least. And it's not explained by the disparate impact of COVID-19 itself. They're roughly the same in terms of mortality in places. So what is that? What was that? So that began the inquiry for me. And part of that is inextricably linked with education policy, school opening policies. We have 50 million kids or thereabouts in our K through 12 system. I'm talking to you from Brooklyn, New York, where like a lot of big cities and a lot of big democratic cities, the schools aren't particularly open. My 12-year-old goes to school twice a week. And this is largely the case in places like Los Angeles and Chicago and elsewhere. And you start to see that there's a kind of a blue state, red state recession, blue state, red state school opening policies that have a disproportionate impact on communities, poorer communities and communities of color or more minority communities. So this became, especially when you look at the school opening aspect of it, a lot of the reasons given for keeping schools closed were done in the name of combating systemic racism, of battling inequities, and to my mind, that is strangely backwards, because the impact of having schools that are not open fall on those communities particularly hard. And so in spooling backwards from all of that, started noticing things that I hadn't particularly keyed in on before, which is the extent to which the Biden administration has enshrined the notion of equity, which is kind of an interesting new twist on the way that we talk about racial disparities in this country and equal opportunity in this country. His first executive order was to examine equity in the federal government, in all programs, in all departments, in all impacts of government policies. So my argument in the piece, besides sort of laying out the history of the word and the concept of equity as it gets into public policy, is to make the argument that the modern parlance of that, which is kind of measuring backwards from outcomes, which is sort of new. Like we used to talk about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes, and it was sort of roughly understood that we want to look for equality of opportunity because that's the easier it's a fix government-wise. If a government that can guarantee perfect parity is a government that's going to probably produce a lot of mass immiseration. But when you start talking about equity, you're measuring backwards from these outcomes. And my argument ultimately is that if you measure backwards from the outcomes of pandemic policies and judge them based on this equity lens, it's really hard to escape the conclusion that the pandemic policies favored in big cities and in democratic polities has been inequitable precisely in those communities that we're trying the most to help.
So for our viewers who might not be completely following along, describe the difference between equity and equality.
The way that it's used now is equity is roughly comparable to equality of outcome. Kamala Harris, right before the election, her sort of closing argument in November, there's an animated video where she sort of explains the difference between equity and equality. And the way that she puts it, equity is when we all end up in the same place. That's kind of new, right? So as I was saying before, equality of opportunity is the idea of removing discrimination in the law and saying, okay, at least we are now no longer actively discriminating against people and saying you can't use the bathroom here, you can't go to school here, you can't do all of that. Equity is looking at equality of outcomes. It's measuring backwards and saying, okay, these policies here have a disproportionately measurably disproportionate bad effect on communities of color, minority, or historically disadvantaged communities. We therefore need to do something about that in order to ameliorate that going forward. So it is a kind of a sea change of difference. And it's one, again, that the Biden administration is now measuring across all departments of government right now.
And so your argument is that if we look at what the Biden administration has done as far as COVID-19, the numbers won't look well for them when we go look at the outcome in the future, correct?
Well, yes and no, right? Because so I wrote this article about 2 months ago, and I was just mentioning the just incredibly disparate impacts of COVID policy on the state and local level. Inarguable, I think. However, also you have to say that right now on the state and local level, there is a disparity in vaccine rollout that it tells a much more favorable story to Democrats, right? The places that have the most vaccine rollout and therefore are bending the curve into submission right now are all Democratic states too. So the world is a complicated place, and we should not let our partisan blinders mask that. However, the Biden administration, by asking us to measure things in this way, and also specifically the way that the Centers for Disease Control have impacted school reopening, particularly in February and March when they issued guidance and then revised the guidance over what can happen. They don't have the authority to tell local school districts what to do. However, they have a lot of influence, particularly in places that are controlled by Democrats, where people, the teachers union in particular, have been very strong in trying to keep schools as closed as possible. They would dispute that characterization. And so they looked at the CDC guidance, which was in February, which was unusually strict. Basically, according to the guidance as written, 90% of the schools that were already open shouldn't have been open by February. They have since relaxed some of those rules. But the Biden administration does bear responsibility for that decision. And it's a bad decision that impacts poor communities the hardest. There are 3 million kids estimated who have disappeared from K through 12 education. That is a catastrophe. The learning loss that we are going to suffer over the last 15 months is abysmal, and it's something that we're going to be grappling with for a long time. And yes, the Biden administration does bear some of that responsibility. But most of what I looked at in the piece is talking about the differences on the state and local level as opposed to the federal level.
Let me remind our viewers that they can take part in this conversation. We're going to open up our regular lines. That means Republicans, your number is going to be 202-748-8000. Democrats, your number is going to be 202-748. I'm sorry, I totally messed it up. Republicans, your number is going to be 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. Remember, you can always text us at 202-748-8003. And we're always reading on social media, on Twitter at CSPAN WJ, and on Facebook at facebook.com/CSPAN. Now, Matt, you and I were just talking about the educational effects of the coronavirus pandemic. You mentioned that your 12-year-old is still going to school part-time in person, part-time virtual. Same thing with my 14-year-old and soon to be 13-year-old.
Ooh.
What is the impact, and how will we know whether the Biden administration did the right thing when it comes to education in America?
Well, all measures are that remote learning has been a bad deal for most kids, and I think most teachers too. It's just not a pleasant way to do anything. There's a generational problem. ProPublica has done wonderful things. Alec McGillis over there and some other reporters in studying the effects, the social effects. I was just looking at a study earlier today talking about the spike in teen suicide attempts. It's been really rough out there. Parents know what I'm talking about. Those who aren't parents just sort of might have heard about it. And it also has effects on employment of people as well, which is not a small thing. In schedules that are unpredictable, it's really hard to have the parents be able to organize their own work. One silly example, I have another daughter who's in kindergarten. She's 6. Someday, and like I believe it's in February, Sunday at 9:30 in the evening, we get an email from our school like, oh, sorry, school's going to be closed for the next 10 days because there were 2 positive cases for COVID in a school of 1,000 people. That was really strict kind of New York guidelines for this. And imagine that you're trying to figure out what your kid's life is going to be. We organized a pod, a learning thing with fellow parents to sort of absorb this. So we are lucky, fortunate enough to do that. Not everybody has the means to do things like that. So the effect on kids, I think, is going to be terrible. The United States is unique in all of the industrialized world in how much our schools were closed, how much kids were wearing masks. Europe, kids under 12 haven't been wearing masks this whole time, basically, in schools. We're still in a lot of places, mandating in New York. I believe it's, kids are supposed to wear masks outdoors during summer camp. If they're 2 or 3 years old, it's madness. And this again is disproportionately happening. I presume that your kids are in the Washington area. Washington is a place, the DC school system, as recently as I believe February of this year. The president of the American Federation of Teachers was recommending that there be an mandated closure for 24 hours if there was a single case positive in a school, and they needed that to wipe everything down. We have known since last June, at least, that COVID-19 does not spread by surfaces. It's not spread by, going to the playground and picking up a cootie. Yet, in places like California, the playgrounds had yellow tape on them well into the fall, sometimes even in the winter. So this, I think, has been very bad for kids. Hopefully they're resilient creatures, but we should look back at this and work backwards and actually take a little moral self-inventory from policy, from just kind of the way that we're approaching things. We sacrificed kids in large effects to our own sense of fears, to our own sense of power distribution in the way that public school policies are impacted and dealt with. My wife is French. We have a lot of French in-laws, people who work in the teaching system. You would normally associate French being, friendly towards unions of all varieties, and they're horrified by how much public sector unions, particularly in schools, impacted policies here in a way to keep schools closed. Hopefully in September, schools will be open full time. However, it's really hard to put the paste back in the tube on this, and schools right now in big districts are grappling with. And New York has decided that there will be no more remote learning. That's being taken off the table. Los Angeles and other places that are keeping it open. We don't know what that's going to look like. I think for sure, and we're already seeing the early returns on this, there's going to be a wide-scale abandonment of the public school system in a way that we have not seen in decades. That's going to affect American life looking forward. It's going to affect the way that that the K through 12 is administered, is funded, and is viewed. And those impacts, I think, we're only probably going to understate them. Such a seismic shift.
We'll get back to that point about the abandonment of the school system in just a moment, but I want to get some of our callers into this conversation. Let's start with Eric, who's calling from Atlanta, Georgia, on the Democratic line. Eric, good morning.
A lot of what you're saying really makes no sense. You're talking about Biden policies. Up under Trump, that was the Socialism Party. Steve Mnuchin was pumping trillions of dollars into these multinational corporations and wealthy billionaire individuals. They're paying no taxes. And also, he was giving money to the farmers. He was tariff taxing. He give money to the airlines, any industry you name. He was doing it. And when the Democrats started wanting to give some money, he was also giving checks to each individual. So the socialism is when the Republicans are in office, they would do anything that they can to make sure that their corporate billionaire donors get money. That's the inequality. And as you talk about, would you agree to this? If Democrats pass a bill and the Republican governors don't want it because they voted against it, that the people in their state will not get the stimulus checks. They will not get unemployment. They will not get these business loans and PPP because they voted against it. And if the representative in their district voted against it, no one gets it. That way we'll have a true democracy. You get what you voted for, a representative.
Go ahead and respond there, Matt.
Well, a couple of things. One is that the basic argument that the Trump administration was a big government administration, absolutely right. Go! Please Google my name and government spending and Donald Trump and Republican Party. You'll see lots of things written about that. I am, as a libertarian, just as a person, and my admittedly idiosyncratic view is that government spends too much money. And one of my specific critiques of Republicans under Donald Trump is that they stopped even the rhetorical move of opposing the growth of government spending and the growth of government in general. On the specifics of whether you should withhold federal spending to places that didn't vote for it, well, first of all of the COVID-related bailout bills that passed under Trump were passed, I think, by an average of around 90 to 95% bipartisan. Incredibly popular. It turns out it's really, really popular for politicians to send checks to people. And I think both parties have learned that. The American Rescue Plan was more on partisan lines. Yes, that is true. I don't think we want to establish the principle that federal monies are held up based on what Republican governors or people who vote no on federal bills are. I think that would have all kinds of legal problems. But as a basic proposition, yes, I'm against corporate welfare all in all. The word socialism was one that was introduced by the caller and not me.
Let's go to Cynthia, who's calling from San Carlos, California, on the Republican line. Cynthia, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN. If I'm remembering right, didn't President Trump urge the governors in each of the states to try to get people back to work as much earlier than it seemed like the CDC was allowing people within the various states? Because each here in California, Governor Newsom put in policies where each county's health directors were telling people what they could do. And just so many people lost jobs. And a high proportion of jobs that were lost were in healthcare, especially for the smaller physicians and physicians' offices. And I also felt quite a toll was taken on people who do not have COVID or a COVID-related medical problem, that they weren't being able to get in to even see their physicians. And so many lives were lost of people who did not have COVID, but their other issues just went that could not be done by telemedicine were not addressed. And then we also lost the lives to suicide. So there's just been a lot of the people not being able to go to school and being, in these perpetual lockdowns. I feel California has lost quite a bit.
Go ahead and respond there, Matt.
Yeah, California, which is my native state, it's I think been tragic, some of its responses. I was mentioning before how playgrounds were closed. I mean, California, the purpose of California, people began moving there 100 years ago to escape tubercular cities, to go outside and take a cure and breathe the air. You have this mild climate, and we've known really for more than a year now that one of the very best things that you can do to combat COVID is just go out in the sunshine and breathe the air that doesn't spread out there, and the sunshine is good for you. And California was pulling surfers out of the water and dumping sand on skate parks and all kinds of policies that are just kind of hideous to think about. Now, as for the Trump point, Trump said a whole lot of different things as president about COVID, like, we're going to reopen during Easter. He, I think, was mixing his messaging pretty on a near constant basis when he was doing the press conference every day. I don't think that was fulfilling the government's role of in a pandemic of communicating clear and consistent information. It's Donald Trump we're talking about. That's not really how he rolls. He injected himself into the school debate and the school reopening debate in a way that is interesting. I think he was right on the terms of it. This is basically last July. He and Betsy DeVos, who's also a polarizing character, regardless of whether you agree with her or disagree with her, they were pretty strong in saying, hey, schools should be open in the fall. I happen to agree with them on that. By doing that, you can see teachers unions, who 95% of their donations go to Democratic politicians, rub their hands in glee because they were able to say, oh, look, the people that we hate and our politicians hate have now strongly been on the opposite side of our argument. If you look at, and people have several, Brookings has looked at this, Education Next at Harvard has looked at this, and say, what is the most determinative factor or predictive factor of whether a school district was open or closed? It was not COVID, ladies and gentlemen. It was literally what the local polity thought of Donald Trump. I wish I could report anything different, because you wouldn't want that kind of sense of partisan split and sort of vitriol and opinion to matter more than, I don't know, a disease and kids and policy, and yet it didn't. So there was an argument at the time when he injected and Betsy DeVos injected themselves in the debate, like, oh no, among people like me who want schools to be open, of like, oh no, this is going to boomerang and allow people to keep schools closed. In fact, I think it did, but that's not necessarily the fault of the president or his then education secretary. I think the fault lies in human beings. You have to start making your decisions based on what is smart, not how much you hate the other guy.
So, Matt, we've been talking about education a lot, and I want to stick with that topic for a little bit more. What would you say to school districts whose teachers are saying, well, nobody's talking about how we're being affected by COVID-19. What about our lives? What if we get infected by working? And so we want to be sure we're safe before we come back. The children might be safe, but what about us? What do you say to districts who bring that up?
Yeah, well, teachers everywhere have been prioritized for the vaccine. I believe from the beginning in most states, 30, 35 states, teachers were basically in the front of the line. And then by March, the Biden administration also made that a priority everywhere. So if a teacher wants to be vaccinated, the teacher is vaccinated. And this, at this point, it's kind of true of anybody in America over the age of 12. So that's not happening. The other thing I would say is that as Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director, said as last July, when she was in the private sector, at least wasn't in the federal government, and which she also has occasionally reiterated as well. Schools are about the safest places there are, right? So you're not going to catch it there disproportionately. Kids themselves, thankfully, knock on wood, despite being little germ monsters, turned out disproportionately not to catch it, suffer from it, or transmit it. It's a fact that hasn't been reiterated enough, but the number of deaths among people who are younger than 18 from COVID is comparatively minuscule. I think it's still under 300. You could die all kinds of ways under the age of 18 before you get to COVID mortality. So it is disproportionately a safe place now. And also in the big cities where they're more likely to be closed, it's also much more likely that teachers have been given the ability to teach remotely. They've been given, there's been a lot of compromises given in the direction of teachers who are afraid that they themselves are immunocompromised, uniquely vulnerable. So that was an argument that was definitely, I think, taken very seriously, probably more seriously in America than most any other country. And now that's over. It's time to get back into school.
Let's go back to our phone lines and talk to Joe, who's calling from Buffalo, New York on the Democratic line. Joe, good morning.
Good morning, Jesse. Hello to your guest. I guess this guy who wants private everything, right? And don't cut me off, please. He wants private roads, private schools, private everything, right? So the rich guys can run everything. This libertarian guy, you got to be kidding me. And the guy never shuts up.
Well, go ahead and respond there, Matt.
You're right. I never shut up. No. So my daughters have gone, just like their parents, to public schools their entire life. We wanted to send our kids to public school forever for a variety of reasons. Not forever. Hopefully they graduate from the things. But we have a strong value of public education in our family. I am sending my 6-year-old to private school in the fall. And it's kind of a heartbreaking decision. I didn't want to do that. Do I want private roads? Sure. Be great. The public one outside my door sure has gigantic potholes. But my journalism and my advocacy is not done out of a sense of trying to privatize every last thing in the world. You can take that for what it is. I understand that people have a distrust and a distaste sometimes for libertarians. It's fine. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have a lot of reasons to hate a lot of others. But I've been writing on the record for 35 years, easily searchable, both my views and my journalism, and judge it for what it is.
You mentioned earlier, and you predict in your article, a exodus from the public schools. Tell us why you think there will be a bunch of parents like you that will be sending some of their children to private schools.
It's already happened. So there's as far as we can tell, there's been a 5% decrease in enrollment for the current school year, the 20 to 21 year over the year before, which makes sense. Some of that, I think the private school is about even as it was before. Charter schools have been just as closed as regular public schools, largely because I think they operate under similar rules. The main growth area has been in homeschooling, and the main growth area within homeschooling has been in poorer and minority communities, interestingly enough. So I think that's likely to increase. We've seen preliminary numbers from New York City school system, which is the country's largest, and I believe that the decrease heading into September in the preliminary numbers, which doesn't even measure my youngest daughter, is that there's going to be an extra 9% decrease. That's a huge, huge number. I'd mentioned before that there's 3 million kids who've dropped out. We don't know where they are. Hopefully they will start coming back into the system or any system in a measurable way. But also, there's concurrent things happening. I think the pandemic is by far the biggest one. It's caused people, people have also seen the Zoom classes, right? They've peeked under the hood a little bit in a way that they hadn't before. They've been exposed to different varieties of schooling, such as pods. So there's that, but also sort of spreading out from places like Brooklyn. Actually, our daughter's school district was the first one here to engage in the name of equity, in the name of desegregation, in a system known as controlled choice, where parents rank their choices, but then administrators or algorithms influenced by administrators kind of control it to try to produce better, from their point of view, kind of demographic leveling between schools, so that there isn't over clustering of people of socioeconomic status or racial status. Controlled choice. This has been sort of faddish since 2007, when the Supreme Court, under John Roberts, outlawed specific race targets in schooling. So what has happened when controlled choice has been implemented, again, as it has been and will be in New York as the system overall? People leave the system. Our school district was the first in New York to implement this on the middle school level. It had been increasing in enrollment for at least a half a decade every year. The first year that they implemented this, there was a decrease in 7%, and this is pre-pandemic. So the people have found, when they looked at this, San Francisco did this, for example, people left the system, and also the underlying segregation, in their words, did not get better. It got worse. So both of those things, I think, are going to contribute, the pandemic much more, obviously, but to people abandoning the system. And you and I might be old enough to remember the 1970s, when people abandoned systems and abandoned cities. Those left behind suffer the most, and it has really kind of a remarkable impacts on communities.
Let's go back to our phone lines and talk to Wade, who's calling from Edgefield, South Carolina, on the independent line. Wade, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I think the public schools have been in trouble for years. I know I had problems. I'm 62 years old, and when I was in school, I actually wound up quitting in 10th and went and got a GED sooner than I would have graduated, which I had to lady that was teaching at the GED school that tutored me some and helped me along. But in 2009, my boy was in public school, and he got to the 3rd grade, and he started having problems with people picking at him and stuff like that. And so I tried to talk with the schools about it, the teachers, the principal. No one really wanted to discuss it. So I wound up taking him out and putting him in a private school, and he done well. He done real well. He's in college now and finishing up. But the schools have been had a problem with public schools for years. And it's what it is. We just got a bunch of fat cats in public schools that are going to do what they want to do, right or wrong, for the kids.
Go ahead and respond there, Matt.
So one of the biggest conundrums of public school in America is that our per student funding, when you adjust for inflation, has increased nearly 300% over the last half century. Yet all the measurable outcomes appear to be basically flat or the same. And this is different in the rest of the world. It's not it's not the same outcome, let's say, in the rest of the world. So what to do about that? Idea that the Reason Foundation, which publishes the Reason magazine, has had for a long time, and I think it's gaining currency. In fact, a lot of bills on the state and local level is that you need competition in the provision of services. You can keep public funding at its current level, let's say, but allow the funding to follow students where students and families feel like they're getting the best value. So maybe that's a charter system. Maybe that just we don't necessarily need the one size fits all model. And this is going to, again, really impact things in the fall, because as in New York, we're getting rid of remote as a possibility. Well, some people like the remote schooling. The majority of people don't. If they're offered full time 5 days a week, they will take it regardless of where they're coming from. But there will be some who, for whatever reason, want to do that. But because New York has mostly a one-size-fits-all thing when it comes to the government provision of public education, that option is going to be taken off the table. So I think there's going to be people looking for more flexible provision of these services, and it makes sense. We engage in competition all over the place, and it generally produces better results. New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, went to a basically system-wide school choice system, and it's worked out pretty well for kids there. So I think we need to be looking more at allowing spending government money on students rather than on school buildings.
What's the solution here, would you say, Matt? You say that some of the policies by the Biden administration don't look like they're going to work. What's the solution?
Well, that's a large question at all times. Right now, so getting back to the concept of using equity as the lens through which to look at things, that can be useful. I think sometimes it can be unuseful in that we kind of over focus on racial categories that themselves are kind of fluid or maybe not even helpful. Like, what is a Latino? What is a Asian American? This is kind of some broad categories, and there are many days that I worry that we're kind of essentializing and flattening our individual characteristics that might not be easily categorized into one neat place. However, that said, sometimes when you do measure outcomes and success, you should be measuring outcomes and success. Generally speaking, every government program should be measured whether it's delivering on its promises or not. So we can use that focus and that imperative as enshrined in the first executive order that the Biden administration published to measure outcomes. Yes, on that they're doing it based on race and socioeconomic status, but also just in general. So if they're going to go through with this, then let us act more like auditors and say, hey, this works and this doesn't, and act upon that. That is hopelessly naive, I am sure. But I think especially in a really polarized political climate when there's widespread distrust of the other team. I mean, we're speaking in a week where there has been kind of a moral panic about critical race theory throughout public education systems everywhere. People are passing laws right and left, like suggesting that teachers have to wear body cams so they don't mention the 1619 Project or something. It's crazy. So there's this widespread distrust. So let's use the equity lens, if we're going to be using it, just as an opportunity to measure government outcomes. And if it's not working, stop doing it, for crying out loud, and allow for more than just one size fits all solutions to all problems.
Let's talk to Larry, who's calling from 29 Palms, California, on the Democratic line. Larry, good morning.
Morning, Jesse, Matt. Hey, a lot of Trump supporters like you don't seem to like government, big government. Well, there's a lot of people like me that spend half my life working for this country to make it good, to give everybody everything they need. Trump's policies with the virus, he should have listened to Pelosi. That was the roadmap to recovery. He gaffed that off. Do you know who Prince is? His sister ran education for 4 years under Trump. They did nothing. We have a saying in California, learn it, live it, love it, or leave it. So a lot of white people like you that are totally disgusted and don't want to live in this country, go back to your God-given country.
Do you want to respond there, Matt?
I think it's actually a useful thing to listen to a caller just make an assumption that I like or love or voted for Trump. based solely because I'm talking about an article that was critical of Democrats. That speaks to a lot of the distrust in this country. And I hope people take it a little bit as a teaching moment, and also to check yourself, if not wreck yourself. If we're going to be dropping like 90s slang from California, you can look at a magazine cover article that I wrote 6 months ago called "The Case Against Trump." Okay? So maybe if you actually listen to what people say, you can have respectful disagreement. You like big government? I respect that to disagreement. It's fine. If we start making assumptions about people, then you make an ass out of you and me, as we also said in California in the 1990s. Let's have responsible adult conversations about what we agree and disagree with, and stop making blind, negative, collective assumptions based on just what we assume that people have or their immutable characteristics. Yes, the color of my skin is white. Who cares?
Let's go to Larry, who's calling from Burnsville, Minnesota, on the Democratic line. Larry, good morning.
Good morning. Well, Mr. 2020 hindsight, why didn't you write your book last July? Just think of all the problems we real and imagined we could have avoided if you would have just written your book last July and told us all these things beforehand. And why do you keep talking about the Biden administration when your book doesn't even cover one day of his administration?
Yeah, so this isn't a book. This is a magazine article that was published a couple of months ago. And I talk about Trump administration, as I mentioned the previous caller. Part of the case against Trump was his pandemic handling in that magazine article. You can go and have a look if you would like. So I write about the Biden administration because they're in power. Part of what a journalist does is look at who is in power and what they are doing in our name with our money, and sitting at the seat of power. In the particular case in the article, the two elements that I put under scrutiny for Biden is the effect that the politicized CDC guidance about schools had on the opening of schools. And again, that's changed somewhat since then. They've kind of went back to it. But the Biden administration invited stakeholders to massage and manipulate the science. And I think that's worthy of criticism. And also just its executive order about equity and what that could possibly mean. It's not necessarily a criticism. It's just sort of an examination thereof. I think it's appropriate to examine in a critical lens Republicans, Democrats, anyone else who happens to be in power. It's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
Well, we'd like to thank Matt Welch, who is the editor-at-large at Reason Magazine, for coming on the show today and talking about his article, The Equity Meds. Matt, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. It was great fun.
And we'd like to thank all of our callers, our viewers, and our guests for another great edition of Washington Journal. Continue to wash your hands, and we will see you again at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Everyone have a great Saturday.